It is your average Saturday night sleepover at the Smith's house. Colin, Dan, and Alex put an end to the night and all head to bed. Colin climbs into the guest bed for what he thinks will be a peaceful slumber. Shockingly, the next morning, Alex, Dan, and his father Steve find Colin dead in his bed, covered in blood with multiple stab wounds. Almost immediately, the suspects begin pointing fingers. Detective Mikey analyzes the scene and is suspicious of the open window. Detective Mikey runs through the scenes in his head. Could it have been Dan who snuck in the middle of the night? Or was it Alex, one of Colin's delinquent friends? Well, what about the father of Dan, Mr. Smith, who always secretly thought Colin was a bad influence on his son? Yet one more suspect has yet to be identified, whoever came through the window in the middle of the night. Going through Colin's phone, they find out that his girlfriend Carol had snuck in the middle of the night and left. She claims to have come and gone prior to any crime. Luckily, DNA was able to be recovered from the knife left behind that was used to murder Colin Waterbug. The next step was to amplify this DNA and perform a DNA fingerprint analysis. DNA found at the crime scene was then amplified and run on separate gels to create DNA fingerprints. The section of DNA we are testing are these variable number of tandem repeats. It is a unit of DNA with repeating bases that does not cause any phenotypic change, but the amount of repeats of the unit varies between individuals. When ran through a gel, the alleles with more repeats will not travel as far as those with less repeats. The distance of alleles of DNA can be specific for certain individuals and used to compare DNA samples. Here we see the DNA fingerprints of our first VNTR locus. We want to see which suspects have alleles that traveled the same distance or match our knife DNA. The victim's alleles clearly do not match the knife's DNA, and neither do Carol's. This excludes both of these suspects from leaving DNA at the crime scene on the knife. Dan Smith has one allele that matches and one that does not. This also excludes him from leaving DNA at the crime scene since both alleles are needed to match. Suspects Alex and Mr. Smith's alleles both match the knife DNA alleles for locus A. To determine which one owns the DNA found at the crime scene, we will need to look at another locus. It is also interesting to note that Dan shares one allele with his father, Mr. Smith, since parents will always pass one allele on to their offspring. At VNTR locus B, we see again that the victim's alleles do not match the alleles of the knife's DNA. Surprisingly, Alex's also don't match, even though his matched at locus A. Again, both individuals are excluded from leaving DNA at the crime scene. Dan Smith again shares one allele with his father, but does not match the knife DNA for both alleles, and can be excluded from leaving DNA at the crime scene. The suspects whose alleles both match the knife DNA alleles at locus B are Mr. Smith and Carol. Both alleles match the knife DNA. To determine whose DNA was left at the crime scene, we need to see which suspect match both alleles of the knife DNA at both loci. As we can see, Mr. Smith's loci matched at locus A, Mr. Smith's alleles matched at locus A and B. Therefore, we can conclude it was Mr. Smith who left DNA at the crime scene, and it was Mr. Smith who killed Colin that night.